A very warm welcome to the Oxford Climate Research Network's annual lecture event. For those who don't know, the Oxford Climate Research Network, or OCRN, is a network for all those people at the University of Oxford with a research interest related to climate. And the network exists to help us be more than the sum of our parts, to allow us to take advantage of opportunities to work across disciplines and help us better project what we do within and beyond Oxford. If you're not already involved and signed up to our mailing list and websites, then you can do so at the link behind me on the screen here, or by emailing ocrn@earth.ox.ac.uk. So I'd encourage you to sign up. The annual lecture event is our flagship event in our calendar, and this year it's going to be focused on addressing the adverse impacts of climate change. Our distinguished speaker, Koko Warner, will be delivering her lecture online today due to an unavoidable late change in plans. And so this will be a hybrid event. We'll start with an online lecture and Q&A for an hour, after which we'll have an in-person panel discussion with some very 3D panelists here based in Oxford. And there'll be an opportunity for you to ask questions there as well. And then at 6 o'clock, we'll move over to the garden room, where there'll be refreshments awaiting and posters highlighting research from across the network, and an opportunity to continue the discussion until 7. So before I hand over to our chair for today to say a bit more about the theme and the details of the event, just a few housekeeping announcements. We're not expecting a fire drill, so if the fire alarm goes off, please make your way out to the fire exits, which are clearly labelled. There's 2 at the back where you came in, and there's some down here. And the assembly point is out on the back lawn of Trinity over in that direction. The toilets are downstairs, accessed from the foyer where you came in. Please make sure that your mobile phones are switched off or on silent mode. And then just a reminder that today's event is being recorded, so do bear that in mind when you're asking questions. And if you really don't want to appear your audio on the recording, then please just let one of us know. So I'd like to hand over now to our chair for this evening's event, and that's Professor Benito Müller. So Benito is the convener of the International Climate Policy Research at the Environmental Change Institute here in Oxford. He's also Managing Director of Oxford Climate Policy, which is a not-for-profit company aimed at capacity building for developing country climate change negotiators. And he's Director of the European Capacity Building Initiative. So I'm going to hand over to him, and he can tell you more about what we're doing here today.
Do I do it? Thank you very much. Thank you, Helen. Yes, when we were discussing what topic we should talk about, I suggested that we do something in memory of my dear old friend Salim Haq, who passed away just before COP last year. Now, this is me and Salim in Bonn last year, so a couple of months before he passed away, and it was a shock to everyone. I mean, it was really very unexpected. Salim and I went back, well, more than 2 decades have we worked together. We first started working together when George W. Bush repudiated the Kyoto Protocol, and we felt, yes, not yes good, but yes, there's an opportunity for Europe to show leadership, but only if they learn how to work with developing countries. That was really, because most of these guys at the time, I'm sure it's still the same, were from environment ministries with no ideas about developing countries. So we formed this European Capacity Building Initiative, which is capacity building by and for Europeans. And we've had meetings, in training workshops in the regions, Oxford fellowships, where the senior people come here to get to know each other. And Salim moved to Bangladesh, and the workshop program sort of stopped for a bit, but we started again literally just 6 months ago, and we had the first workshop 2 weeks ago in the Caribbean again, and he's really sorely missed. Salim is also one of the champions of loss and damage, long before the term became acceptable. And in, 2006, Cameron Hepburn and I wrote a piece about the International Air Passenger Adaptation Levy. It didn't fly. But, and I basically gave up. A year and a half ago, Salim came and said, look, this loss and damage thing, this is happening. Let's do it for loss and damage. Climate Solidarity Levy. And we are working on it, also in memory of Salim. And it is, I'm pleased to say, it has a good chance to happen. So this is something which, in my mind, the best way to honor someone's memory is to try to continue the work which they so passionately believed in. And this is why I also suggested we get a speaker who is familiar with the work of Salim, who is doing loss and damage stuff. And Koko came to mind, and I think it's going to be a brilliant opportunity to honor both Salim's work on this topic and everyone else who is working in this area. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Benito, for the kind introduction. Hello to everyone in the room. I hope the sound is okay, and I very much wish that I could be with you today to honor Salim and also to carry on the work that so many of us are involved in together. I've been introduced, so maybe just before I start the prepared comments, for those of us who have experienced loss in life, I'd like you just to reflect for a moment about your thoughts and feelings from the moment that you discovered that you would experience loss, whether it's something trivial or inconvenient, like losing a wallet, to something profound that might change your life. And I'd like you just to reflect on the thoughts and feelings and how those thoughts and feelings unfolded over time. And it's against that background that we honor Salim and think really very much, Benito, about the challenge that you just gave to all of us in carrying the work forward. And I'll begin here. In the context of international climate policy, as all of you know, loss and damage refers to unavoided climate change impacts. And those can include extreme weather events that many of you are quite expert at, slow onset events ranging from sea level rise, increasing temperatures, changes in rainfall regimes, loss of biodiversity. And as Benito alluded, over 30 years of international climate policy, some have argued that focusing on adjusting to climate change would distract high-emitting countries from avoiding impacts in the first place through decarbonization. And others argued that insufficient mitigation by high-emitting countries has unleashed an unfair burden on low-emitting countries. In the UNFCCC process, this has contributed to a framing of the issues focused on who pays and how much. These debates drew out discussions about how to address loss and damage, especially for frontline communities, for many years. And familiar faces and colleagues, including, of course, Salim, Benito, Keishan, many of you here today have been part of these discussions. The impasse was broken at the 27th Conference of the Parties, COP27 in Egypt, through a decision on new funding arrangements for loss and damage, including a new fund. Reflecting on funding needs, Maldives Environment Minister Aminath Shana argued at COP27 that the world requires a mosaic of solutions. This idea that there are many parts of the solution, and the key is in putting financial arrangements together to deliver coherent support where it is needed, shifted the debate from how much to how. And then just a few months ago at COP28, the fund was operationalized and began receiving pledges of support that span traditional and non-traditional donors. And today marks the first meeting of the board of the fund for responding to loss and damage. The board is part of a larger effort we are all part of to find ways to bring online this mosaic of funding arrangements. Several questions require insights from the scientific community on how to assemble all of these different financial arrangements and do so in ways that are people-centered and operationally relevant for frontline communities. And my comments today will highlight some of these. The risks and impacts of anthropogenic climate change are increasingly apparent in all parts of the world, with the past decade being the warmest on record. Every subsequent year since 2016 has broken new historical heat trends, augmented by a strong El Nino. Last year, global average temperature was estimated at 1.45 degrees Celsius. We're also increasingly familiar with the damages and costs linked to extreme weather. Now, I've chosen a few examples in the next moments, which are closer to home for the audience here today. And I've also chosen these examples to illustrate that climate change impacts are here and now. We used to think that climate change impacts were a long time in the future, and certainly not close to us. They were far away, happening to people that we don't know. But we know now, and we're living the experience of these impacts. And for this reason, let's start with some of the familiar ways we hear about damage and costs. And that often, Nicola, I'm so glad to see you there. We often start by finding out from insurance, what has the damage been? What are the costs? More than a quarter of the cost to the insurance industry from biophysical disruptions now come from thunderstorms. From 2000 to 2009, 3 thunderstorms cost the insurance industry more than $1 billion US. From 2010 to 2019, there were 10 such storms. Since 2020, there have been 6. America experienced 28 extreme weather events causing over $1 billion in damage last year, exceeding the previous record. In Europe, losses from extreme weather have exceeded $5 billion annually for the past 3 years. We're also seeing damage and associated costs to property emerging linked to slow onset processes. And this, for me, was surprising. Some of you may have also read this recently. The patterns differ a little bit. Mega cities like Kolkata, Mumbai, and Dhaka are the most exposed to rising sea levels in terms of population. Megacities like Miami, Guangzhou, and New York face the highest property value risks. Buildings in large urban areas like London and Amsterdam, again, a little bit closer to where the audience is today, are sagging as the clay beds on which they're built dry out and cause subsidence. 2/5 of London's housing stock, equivalent to 1.8 million homes, will be susceptible to subsidence by 2030. Remediation for subsidence often involves concrete underpinning and can cost a homeowner about £10,000 or more. British homeowners may pay out almost £2 billion annually on subsidence claims by 2030. Roughly 40% of property value in Amsterdam could be wiped out by these kinds of physical risks. Now, let's take a little bit of a comparison. That same figure for Tokyo is a little bit lower. It's estimated in contrast to 40% at 7%. That's because Tokyo improved drainage and flood defenses after Typhoon Kit in 1996. So in more recent thunderstorms and typhoons, those investments reduced damage. I could go on, but you get the picture. These examples of property risk from climate change impacts illustrate some of the stakes for financial stability, investments, and government finances. And the reason why I chose homes is that so many of us in maybe the part of the world where we are who might own homes or rent spaces, all of our financial assets are concentrated there, and they take up a big part of the world's markets. We also see a need for coherence and coordination in financial arrangements related to these types of impacts. Staying with home investment portfolios, physical risks may cost 6% of the value of housing held in investment portfolios. Now, we're starting to talk about shifting. We're in the world as we know it, and we're looking out, and we know that we need to change. But one of the challenges is that market signals about climate-related risks to property, just as an example, are often distorted. Sometimes insurance rates are not priced to reflect the actual risk. Sometimes government disclosures about tax-funded subsidies for areas with very high risks are inadequate. State-backed mortgage giants like Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac in the United States may face defaults if borrowers cannot afford home insurance in the face of some big risk like flooding or a hurricane or another weather-related impact. And these risks may ultimately fall to governments, especially if multiple climate impacts evolve simultaneously. Now here I've focused on a certain kind of country, maybe in the global north, where there's a bit more means to raise taxes, where people may have relatively deeper pockets than in places in the world that Salim and Benito and all of our community really tried to bring to world attention. But I think these examples illustrate that we're truly all in this together, and understanding financial arrangements and building them will affect all of us. We all have skin in the game. These examples illustrate some of the gaps in both our approach to financial instruments in the real economy, as well as finding ways to address adverse climate change impacts. So again, the key question is less about how much money. There probably won't be enough money in the world to stay the way we are. But rather, how do we design and deploy the mosaic of financial modalities and tools at our disposal today, as well as creating new ones? This may involve mixes of equity, debt, risk management, to build those capital stacks, those layers of financial tools that can help us, our loved ones, our governments, countries in our regions to navigate the impacts that are upon us. Hug's legacy draws our focus to frontline communities. Salim dedicated much of his work in international climate change policy to bringing the lessons learned about dealing with adverse climate change impacts from frontline communities and in places as diverse as Dalabanga and Dhaka, Bangladesh, to experiences in least developed countries. Salim worked tirelessly with many in our community to advance policy, finance, and practice around loss and damage. Climate change is anticipated to have enduring effects on the real economy. This might manifest as depressed production, decreased employment or shifting employment, diminishing social coherence, cultural loss. All of these stress societies and public and private budgets. Climate-related emergencies could involve displacement or relocation, either planned or unplanned, and may necessitate climate-resilient reconstruction and recovery. Slow onset events may involve redistribution of where and how people live. All of this will require insights from social, economic, and climate data. And Salim's message, and one we carry forward very much, Benito, in the spirit that you introduced this lecture, is that addressing these needs should improve people's situation, not keeping them at the brink of survival. So what steps will improve coherence and coordination across the landscape of global, regional, national institutions that fund activities to address loss and damage? Well, just in the recent years, we've experienced things that aren't climate change impacts, but which have some of the characteristics. The pandemic, for example, was global. It affected all places in the world. And for a time, it seemed that it would never end. And we've gained many insights from the economic dimensions of COVID-19. We know it transformed the world. Some of those transformations, like in the labor markets, that I can join you today virtually, might not go back. There have been profound economic and social consequences, in addition to the tragic health toll from the spread of the virus. Governments deployed trillion-dollar economic stimulus packages in the face of a sustained disastrous impact on lives, on production, consumption, and on financial services. Some countries experienced devastating inflation and other impacts in these years following the pandemic. And some of those impacts came as a result of how they attempted to address the impacts of the pandemic. Deep lessons lie for us in the economic management of this global occurrence. We know now that we cannot assume that there are no comorbidities alongside climate stressors, and yet often in our discussions, whether it's in sessions of the UNFCCC or in other parts of our work, we get very focused on particular aspects. And often even amazing scholars like yourselves, sometimes in the conversations, the systemic elements and the linkages aren't enough in focus. Bringing that thought to this discussion here today, this means that funding arrangements to address loss and damage need also to consider additional investments in health, adequate housing, social safety nets, education, and services that build resilience. Often because we've learned so much from the examples that I started with, from extreme weather events and the costs of repairing and reconstruction. Sometimes that shapes our understanding of what climate change might mean for us. But of course, we're learning, unfortunately, that there's a lot more to consider. Almost 4 years ago at the General Assembly, the UN Secretary General called for all nations to use every economic tool available to foster a resilient green recovery from the pandemic. He mentioned fiscal tools like tax policy, public support, investment in jobs, central banking tools, and the pursuit of equity and stability. This echoes the ambitions of the Paris Agreement, Article 2.1c, to align all of our economic tools in the pursuit of a climate resilient, sustainable world. So what do we need to do to build these layers of finance, these capital stacks? I borrowed that term from Mark Carney, with this mosaic of modalities and tools that we have. Well, as discussions continue to unfold on loss and damage funding arrangements, including at the fund board meeting today and on throughout the year, at least 5 contributions from your work, from research, would help shape the mosaic of solutions. And again, this is all against the background of that main idea. Of course, it's important to get a feel for how much, but what we additionally need to focus on is how. How do we build the financial arrangements in a way that navigates towards stability, even if we can't have it at any moment? And just hearkening back to Salim's life work, it's important for all of us, and it's particularly important for least developed countries and small island development states, of whom he and Benito and many of you are and were constant champions. So what are these 5 areas? First, we need to know much more about the distributional impacts of climate-related shocks. And we need to understand the distribution at a subnational level and under different climate conditions. Financing arrangements are affected by impacts on the production and consumption of food in their growing seasons, on fresh water, on ecosystem performance and critical public services such as healthcare. And these typically are not fully considered, and they need to be. If we don't consider these interactions, we might be blindsided and might not build in the appropriate financing risks for addressing loss and damage. Analysis is needed about how climate impacts affect the financial health of formal and informal financial institutions like community banks, agricultural credit unions, local insurance and safety net institutions. These profoundly affect the well-being of real people who experience climate change impacts of farmers, small businesses, households. This type of analysis would provide deeper insights into exposure and vulnerability, and also manage financial risks associated with adverse climate impacts. And that's what people-centered means. Second, more work is needed about interactions of climate change impacts and other market dynamics on different asset classes, in different geographies, and in different sectors. We're just beginning to understand some of the unanticipated impacts in labor markets, municipal bonds, stock markets, real estate, pensions, supply chain dynamics. Helpful work has started to emerge about interactions of climate risks with transitional risks. I live in Germany, and there's been a lot of attention to how Germany is managing its transitional risks. The UK has very advanced or kind of really progressive climate change policy. Other countries have lessons to learn. And it's this understanding, taking it to the next step and understanding how policies interact with the real economy that will help us rapidly learn and continue to progress and push forward. We need models to help explore how efforts to adapt to climate change impacts could affect all of these things that I just mentioned: banking, real estate markets, land tenure and zoning, bond markets, and publicly financed infrastructure. Here's an example. I'll go back to Miami. It's becoming really important that economic risk assessment also reflect climate-related physical and transition risks. If these risks are overlooked, it could lead to misinformed decisions. For a normal person on the street like me, it might affect what house I buy or what property I rent. For a city or an entity issuing a municipal bond, it may affect the willingness of people to buy the bond to pay for the construction of public infrastructure. If these risks are overlooked, if decisions are misinformed, this could contribute to systemic shocks that come from inappropriate, for example, securitization of mortgages in high-risk coastal areas. Some banks in the city that I mentioned, or in the state of that city, are already starting to think twice about issuing 30-year mortgages for homes. Investment in assets could be stranded, or real economic activities that otherwise lead to negative public externalities might not be avoided. Third, we need a critical assessment of valuation and societal risk tolerance. And one of the reasons that this societal risk tolerance is so important is so many of our public institutions are geared to protecting society, protecting consumers, protecting investors. So much of our financial governance has to do with how we think about risk and how much we tolerate it and how we govern it. Now, there are literature on different ways to evaluate. The work of Bob Costanza or many other wonderful scholars are thinking about how we place value on ecosystem services or things that maybe before we were more aware of climate change, we took for granted. These values can help inform market and financial regulatory aims that may include data and tools to monitor, analyze, and quantify a range of both extreme and slow onset climate risks, and offer a better understanding of sector-specific production, consumption, and financial institution responses. Areas of modeling could also help us, and they could help us understand the interaction of climate impacts and structural change. For example, the role of market perceptions about climate risk in pricing or repricing of assets, and potential cascading effects on system-wide financial stability. That can happen through portfolios and balance sheets. There are a range of common policy tools that have a role to play as we build out financial arrangements for addressing loss and damage. As the fund board takes up its work, it would be useful to bring in experiences from such policy tools. I'll name just a few. Risk management of markets and financial institutions, disclosure, consumer and investor protection, oversight of systemic financial risk, and experiences using legislation to ensure coordinated national economic responses to climate impacts. Now, there's a large gray literature, often produced by independent public agencies, providing evidence of the outcomes of tools like these. It would be helpful for purposes like the IPCC to bring more of this work into peer-reviewed journals. Fourth, where I talked about national tools, now let's talk about regional and global monetary coordination. This will become increasingly important to provide fiscal space for governments when disruptions affect their finances. For example, regional financing arrangements allow groups of countries to pledge mutual financial support to members experiencing financial difficulties in their regions. This has been used in Europe and in Gulf cooperation countries and in many other regions for a variety of circumstances, ranging from flooding to financial crisis, with a lot of lessons learned. Special drawing rights from the International Monetary Fund could also help stabilize exchange rate volatility, which can be a measure of a country's economic health. Considerable research is needed on economic tools like these that aim to provide stability for larger geographic regions in spite of sustained and unfolding disruptions. And fifth and last, managing emergencies. Support in response to climate-related emergencies is currently channeled through humanitarian funding. In my work currently, the International Organization of Migration, I see the distribution of emergency payouts to inject cash and support for temporary shelter, food, basic life support to afflicted communities worldwide. Of course, these communities don't want to stay displaced for a long period of time. Most of the time, if any of you had a chance to go and visit some of the shelters where people stay for far too long, they'll tell you that they're really grateful for the support, and what they want is ways to pool their money in a saving fund to start a micro business, or ways to make sure that their children have vocational training. People are always thinking about building towards the future. And as we manage and finance our emergencies, we need more and different tools to both manage the risk, but also to enable the pivot from humanitarian and emergency response onto a more sustainable long-term, maybe development pathway. Additionally, speaking of that, debt instruments such as loans, bonds, budget reallocations currently finance reconstruction and recovery. And as we put together these different layers, these tools might be combined in different ways. The lessons that we've learned that have worked out well in situations like the pandemic could be drawn upon. We will probably create new types of tools. But the task ahead of us is to stack up and combine these, as well as I said, the future tools we have yet to create to foster demand for public and private investment. As we create these capital stacks or financing arrangements for loss and damage, they'll probably involve equity, debt, risk management. These capital stacks must be deployed both at a large scale and also be designed so that they can reach small scales. Always remembering Salim's championing of frontline communities. They need to be designed in ways that, boy, people's ability to navigate disruptions across their life cycle, such as investments in health, vocational education, social safety nets, restoration of ecosystems. There's clearly a lot of work ahead for us. In conclusion, for those of you supporting the funding arrangements on loss and damage, including a fund, I hope that these thoughts have been useful and really foster a great panel discussion that follows. New and additional capital from a new fund alone will be a positive step in a much longer journey. The decision from both COP27 as well as COP28 recognizes that a variety of mechanisms, including through international financial institutions, multilateral development banks, central banks, and social safety net programs are required to shape and channel support to address needs. Operationalization of funding arrangements raises many questions about how to adjust timing, eligibility, requirements, and access these funds to promote stability. Information is needed about funding gaps and creative and effective solutions for filling those gaps to help vulnerable populations and also ecosystems on which they depend. Analysis about the real economy will deepen understanding of the full dimensions of escalating nonlinear impacts. We really need this understanding for the design of systems and structures to provide stability and enhance well-being in the face of progressive upheaval and uncertainty. I've mentioned 5 areas for greater work that could be of service in building and combining financial arrangements needed for stability. These are about distributional impacts, about the interaction of climate change impacts and other market dynamics, assessment, evaluation, and societal risk tolerance, regional and global monetary coordination, and how we manage emergencies. Developing this mosaic of solutions means harnessing the strength of the global economy to deliver stability in robust, flexible ways that can anticipate and address societal needs in the face of advancing adverse climate impacts in every area of the world. We have a lot of work ahead, and it's great to be in a community of such dedicated scholars and practitioners. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Koko. I just realized from my little sort of agenda here, I forgot to introduce you. Koko Warner, Director of the International Organization for Migration's Global Data Institute, please. We are in good time, so we can do some audience questions. Please wait for the microphone, because otherwise Koko can't hear you. That would be useless. So do we have any questions for Koko? Hold on, let me put on my... Yeah. Now, yes. Miles.
Thank you very much indeed for that, Koko, and thank you for that lecture. It's great that you're able to join us to talk about these really important matters. In your list of 5, and this is something, I hope you don't mind me picking up on an argument I've been having with Benito for a long time, which is where the attribution of harm fits into all this. In private litigation, establishing harm, establishing standing and so on is emerging as a really important topic. Lots of people are very keen for it not to emerge as an important topic in loss and damage, because you can see all sorts of... I'm really interested in your thoughts on that, about where it would go, and also what the relationship might be between loss and damage fund and the sort of emerging questions about private efforts to assign harm to greenhouse gas emitters.
Thank you so much, Miles. And I've admired your and your colleagues' work for a long time on attribution. I think together with Salim, Benito, and others, I don't know if you work that much together on a day-to-day basis, but on the international stage, you've created a very significant impact over the years because of your work. My thought goes to, when it comes to attribution of harm, my thought goes to two parts of essentially my wish list for the scholarly community. One is understanding societal risk tolerance, and the other are these range of policy tools. The more we become aware, in part because of the wonderful work that many of you do, including you, Miles, the more that we understand the sources and the cause of harm, the more society, in theory, could be enabled. It depends, of course, on the country that a person lives in and the society and the kind of discourse that matters very, very much. But the better aware we are of where risk and harm comes from, in theory, the better we are to determine what risks we are willing to bear and tolerate and at what levels, as well as how policies need to be shaped in a way that that affected society is willing to bear, if that makes sense. So those are two additional debates in addition to the physics and statistics that you're all doing. And it's not easy. Some countries, as they shape their domestic policies, are very sensitive to topics that you've mentioned. And we've heard cases recently, and I think there are probably now hundreds, if not thousands, of such cases that take a form of attribution science. Of course, you're the pioneers, and bring that to bear in a courtroom. In countries where courtrooms play a role in shaping regulation and play a role in the policy debate, there's probably a significant leverage. Not all countries use those tools. And so, as I would love to actually turn it around and hear your experiences, maybe if I were there, we could have that conversation about the role of these private efforts in a loss and damage fund. We do know that if you look at 1 CP21, that was they didn't call it a cover decision at the time, but it had that cover decision field, introduced the Paris Agreement as a legal instrument. Paragraph 51, if I'm not mistaken, or maybe it's 52, did cordon off things like liability and compensation. And so in an international setting, while those issues are cordoned off and they're excluded, so to speak, certainly in a domestic and maybe even a regional context, very, very relevant.
Thank you. Any other questions? Well, let me take Koko. As you and I know, everyone knows, there's this meeting going on right now, today and the next 2 days. There's the board meeting of the fund. They don't even know the name yet, but officially it's the fund responding to loss and damage. What would you want to tell these people for the next 2 days? What is your advice? Key things they should keep in mind from your perspective.
Oh, well, the most wise thing for me to do would be to listen. And what I would tell them, if it were appropriate to convey, I think we tend to get very focused on, and if you look at the agenda, which I did right before we met today, it's all about organizational modalities. As these things, they have to be set up. And so that's very much where the discussion is now. And I think also there are institutional dynamics. You'll have the World Bank as a possible host for the financial intermediary fund, and they have certain ways of doing things. And then you have a group of board members, many of whom have come out of a negotiating tradition from the UNFCCC. So they'll probably be starting on on very different footing. And I know there have been several conversations. If it were, one, I'm not there, two, I would listen, but three, in a better world, I wish that I would find the words to convey what Salim knew, which was the reality of frontline communities, and bring that in a compelling way to designing the modalities of the fund. And I just wish that we could be part of switching the debate, because we have very little time. It shocked me when I read scientific literature and also newspaper reports towards the end of last year that the average temperature, of course, with a good El Nino push, was already at 1.45. We thought that wouldn't be here for a bit. We have very little time, and their needs are very great. We really need to accelerate designing tools that can be deployed at scale.
Thank you very much. Yes, we have a question up there. Can someone come down with a mic? Yes.
Thank you. My name's Clara Gallagher. I work at IIED. I like the connection on talking about kind of understanding societal risk tolerance, and then the question that I have often then is, you might have that understanding, but then how do you connect that into the kind of development funders, the IFIs, or even kind of underwriters, people who are driven by things that maybe aren't values connected? Like, where would you begin on that kind of, I don't know, interfacing, however you want to call it, to start bridging that quite wide gulf? Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Clara. I think that's such an important question. I'll go to my day job. I'm here as a colleague and long-term associate and friend of Salim, but if you'll let me, Clara, I'll just go to my day job. I direct a global data institute at the International Organization of Migration. And in that world, we're really concerned about displacements. And climate change impacts on displacement are becoming more and more evident. But let me just draw on that. It's not a pure world of climate example, but I'll tell you what we're learning so far. In talking with communities who have been displaced, there are a couple of things that are pretty surprising. And what I'm going to explain is the gulf by design, and probably for good reasons. There's a great gulf between humanitarian funding, which is life-saving, and development funding, which has a whole bunch of modalities. It can be grants, it can be debt, a whole bunch of things. But they're often anchored in national policy documents, like the budget is defined very, very specifically. And because a lot of these types of funds are, I don't have to tell you that, Clara, I'm just kind of giving context. But because these funds, these public funds, coming from taxpayer money, they're very precious, there needs to be accountability, the rules around deploying them are quite strict. So in the world of displacement, it is sometimes in a conflict situation and sometimes in a flooding situation, a matter of saving lives. Communities are displaced, they're uprooted. Sometimes people land in a shelter, in a camp. Sometimes they disperse to urban areas. But what we find is that people tend to be displaced for a very long time. You think you get displaced and then you start setting down roots. But people stay, on average, we've found through our data, for 10 years. And for the lifetime of a child, that's all of their education. For a young adult, 10 years. Imagine if you were displaced at 15 and you don't get out of a situation of displacement well into your 20s. What's happened to your education? What's happened to your vocational opportunities? And so, Clara, to your question, what we've done is a whole slew of data collection about when displacement starts. We've collected a whole bunch of correlated type data on what are solutions. For example, if you are in a situation of being displaced, you don't have a home. And so some of the solutions, we call them durable solutions, are housing, services, ID, because when people experience some rapid disruption, often they don't have their personal identification with them, that they need to access services, and. So we do correlations and find out, how does this programming correlate to the outcomes that people experience? And you do that over time. Of course, you can ask people what they prefer. Now, that may not get to the perfect kind of view of societal risk tolerance, but it starts. A lot of this work has to do with social cohesion and understanding host communities. If we stay with this example of displacement, you have to ask host communities what they need and what they aspire to. And from those, both the data analysis as well as qualitative work, you get a picture. And a picture which will be completely unsurprising to any of you is if you want to invest in it would be three things: investing in housing, investing in jobs, investing in social connection.
Thank you. I have to tell you something right now, is that exactly a year and a week ago, Salim and I published a piece which talked about just impact transition. Most people will have heard of the idea of just transition, which is about coal miners losing their livelihoods, it's unfair and all that. Salim and I were convinced it is not just energy transition. It's also, if a subsistence farmer in Bangladesh loses his livelihood because of a hurricane, we need just transition. And this goes way beyond just giving him $5,000, okay? In Bangladesh, the problem is that most of these chaps and families, they end up in Dhaka in a slum. The situation is just terrible. So what they were thinking about, I don't know how far that went, but they had the idea of actually setting up cities for climate refugees, right? So that there's a place to go, not to the slum and aggravating everyone's problem, but to a designed place where you have schools, you have bakeries, the whole lot, okay? And Salim was adamant that the poorest of countries can show the rest of the world what we need to do in certain circumstances. It's not just us going to tell them, they can actually tell us. And I was wondering, Koko, what you think about this?
Oh, thanks, Benito. My mind goes back, sorry to date us, but my mind goes back to, gosh, the time around Cancun. What was that, 2010? And right, it's forever ago. These are not new conversations, but exactly, we found a lot of operationally relevant conversations with frontline communities about I use the word solution a little bit casually, about the kind of packages that they would need and find helpful in managing these disruptions. And I have so many memories of Salim, not to go down memory lane, but of being on boats on the Ganges, going to visit communities in coastal areas and asking the people about what they need, what their levels of risk tolerance are, and what they need to get on to the next step. Was very much Salim driving the conversation, and the affected communities really wanting to have that conversation. And again, the reason why I brought in the examples for those of us who live in the global north, and I'm sure not everybody does who's listening to this event, is a lot of those conversations, and Clara, going to your point, it feels like, oh, it's so far away, it doesn't affect me, but it really does, because a flood is one season away for many of us, or a drought, the impacts are not far away. We really need to build these tools together and to do so with haste.
Thank you very much. A final question. There we go. Yes, please.
Hi, hello. I'm a postdoc at geography here, Giovanna. Like, just going back to this idea of societal risk tolerance, right? And how we measure that. Like, I work with communities that, you know, that have been displaced or relocated because of climate change. And I realized that a lot of these communities are already like racialized, marginalized, living in very precarious places and situations in general. And they call it resilience, right? Because, you know, they can live in flood situation for 2-3 weeks in a row, and that will be okay. But obviously, when you take the situation and you compare with human rights and other life standards and dignity, they are far, far away from ideal, right? And I was thinking, like, how do you, or how we should harmonize, like, this idea of how much a society can tolerate risk and how it's like fair them to tolerate risk. And how do you measure that in modeling and quantitative data? Yeah, thank you.
Well, Giovanna, in terms of methodologies, that alone is a really interesting discussion. And I know I'll be chiming in and listening into your next distinguished lecture or to any of you talking about those methodologies. One thing I would say just briefly, because Benito, I think you wanted to move on to the panel, and Giovanni, really happy to connect with you afterwards on the methodologies. But one thing that we do notice in my day job, people move towards opportunity and they move away from risk. People cope as best they can. But we have noticed, how do I say this? Trends in all kinds of things, whether it's employment, whether it's where you live, how you live, that people look for their own solutions if there is not a path prepared. That is found in trends in, as I mentioned, employment, in migration. I could name half a dozen others, but it is really important for stability to really recognize these trends are and will unfold at scale, at large scale. Going back to the displacement example, there is some evidence that neglecting displaced communities can spread. It can create, how do I say it in the right way? It can become a more widespread challenge for an entire country, if not a region. We simply can't afford, in terms of our ideals in terms of our pocketbooks, to ignore. It's very much the work ahead of us. And again, you know, building on Salim's legacy to address the risks and design pathways. Some of those pathways are financial. All of those pathways will involve different pieces. But simply ignoring marginalized communities just won't work for very long. And we may find ourselves at some point among those marginalized.
Thank you. Just one more question from me, because I was just looking at your Organization for Migration. What do they do?
The International Organization of Migration does 3 things. We're involved with many organizations worldwide saving lives. And that's why I mentioned displacement so much. If there is a conflict, if there's been a drought or a flood, anything that puts people, communities in harm's way, where they need very quick emergency assistance, our organization is there among many, many others. The second thing that we do is we look for solutions to displacement. Just as I've been bringing in these examples, many people In fact, if any of you thought of it yourselves, you may actually know people in all kinds of places in the world who've experienced displacement. And once you've been uprooted, the work is to get rooted again and to keep moving forward with your lives. And the third is to facilitate regular migration pathways. Now, that may take us out of our climate world. We may, in this world, might not think so much about regular migration, but it goes a little bit to Giovanna's question. People find solutions if there isn't a regular pathway. And here, in case of migration, that means a visa. You are permitted to cross from one country to another. If people don't have regular ways to do that, and their lives are on the line, or their families need to be fed, or the opportunity is calling, some people find ways. And the downside of that is irregular pathways are dangerous. They're a loss to the people involved. They're a loss to governments who are sending and governments who could be receiving. And so we coordinate and facilitate that. Those are the three things.
Thank you so much. Dear panelists, and I shall introduce you. It is my great pleasure to introduce you to my dear friends and fellow panelists this evening. We have my fellow countryman, Sam, Professor Sam Fankhauser. He grew up about 20 kilometers from me. It doesn't show. He is Professor of Climate Economics and Policy and Research Director of the Oxford Net Zero. And there is Professor Lavanya Rajamani, Professor of International Environmental Law at the Oxford University, Yamani Fellow in Public International Law at St. Peter's College, and last, certainly not least, Dr. Nicola Ranger, Resilience and Development Group Lead at the Oxford Environmental Change Institute, Executive Director of the Oxford Martin Programme on Systemic Resilience. I now invite the panelists to speak their mind for 3 minutes, and then we go on a little discussion. Thank you. Mike. Oh, you all hooked up. Okay,
I think we're wired up.
Please.
Okay, ladies last. That's the way. That's the way to Swiss do it. No, save the best to last. Let me start with with Salim and my reflection on Salim. He's been a constant in my climate change journey, as I imagine he's been in many people's climate change journey. He's been there forever almost. I've done climate change for 30 years, and Salim has been in that business for the same 30 years. So there's been that constant, almost reassurance of somebody smart, insightful, and passionate in the room wherever you went to those various gatherings. And Salim, of course, was somebody who moved into the vulnerability and adaptation space very early on, when most people still talked about energy. And it was often his role to talk common sense and debunk some of the common myths that were out there. Myths like adaptation is something for the future, and Salim would remind us that it was something for the here and now. That's a statement of the bleeding obvious this year and the last couple of years, but it wasn't always a statement of the bleeding obvious, but it was always true, and Salim was somebody who would remind people of that. There was people who would say adaptation is a cop-out, and it means we don't have to reduce emissions. And Salim would be somebody who would remind us that there are limits to adaptation, and if you breach those limits to adaptation, you incur loss and damage. And he said that very powerfully, as Koko said as well. And when people went on about technocratic solutions and building seawalls and raising money, all of which is important, he would remind us that this is about communities, this is about people. So he has always been, that sort of source of grounding and anchoring the debate in a good way in sort of my interactions with him. Let me just dig deeper on one of those points that Koko also mentioned in her lecture, and something that Salim always said as well, that when we talk about adaptation to climate change, dealing with the consequences of climate change, it isn't about sort of individual projects, sort of a heat-resistant crops here, seawalls there, air conditioning, and so on. It is about the systemic understanding of how economic development interacts with vulnerability. So if we have economic development plans that are centered around urban development, which many successful economic development plans have been, we have to understand how we switch the vulnerability profile from rural vulnerability, which is a story of exposure of farmers to weather event and what that does to yields, to a sort of a vulnerability profile that has to do perhaps with coastal vulnerabilities, with storm surges, sea level rise, perhaps with exposure to heat stress if you're an outdoor worker. So you change the vulnerability profile as a function of your development strategy. Similarly, a lot of development strategies have to do with export-led growth. That's sort of, the success of the Asian economies. If you do export-led growth, again, that might be a smart thing to do, but you have to understand what that does to vulnerability, and it does both good things and bad things. It spreads the impact of a particular local shock across the community, and that can be great if you're the one with the bad harvest and you can sort of spread the food price risk through importing food, or it can be bad because you're importing other people's shocks at the same time. And when we did in the UK the climate change risk assessment a couple of years back, one of the dominant risks actually for the UK wasn't what's happening in this country, it's the sort of shocks that we exposed to through international trade and interaction with the international community. So those are sort of just two examples of how we should understand adaptation as a development challenge, as climate resilient development, rather than a series of projects. I'm sure my 3 minutes are up.
Oh, no. Lavanya.
Thank you, Benito, and thank you, Koko, for such a sort of thoughtful talk on addressing the adverse impacts of climate change impacts, and particularly for your focus, I think, on framing this issue as one of how rather than how much or who pays, which is much more polarized, and obviously there are limits to how far you can go with that conversation. So while I very much endorse your sort of intuition and findings on this issue, I'd like to sort of zoom out a little bit, unlike Sam who zoomed in. I'd like to zoom out a little bit and talk about the role of the UN climate change regime and the international climate change law more generally in relation to adaptation as opposed to mitigation. And in relation particularly to delivering the sort of people-centered, operationally relevant ways to address climate change impacts. So the UN climate change regime, as we know, was heavily mitigation focused in the early years. And in fact, both the Framework Convention and the Kyoto Protocol were framed very much around, especially the Kyoto Protocol, very much around mitigation. It's only in the last decade or so that adaptation and loss and damage have been brought to the fore, and this is very much a function of work done by Salim in particular, but many in that community that have brought adaptation, vulnerability, and loss and damage to the fore. But notwithstanding the sort of monumental work that has been done to bring these to the fore, particularly by Salim, there's still a cross-cutting distinction across the UN climate change regime between mitigation and adaptation, both in relation to the specificity of the goals in relation to greenhouse gas mitigation as opposed to adaptation, where the mitigation goals are far more quantitative, both, for instance, in relation to the temperature goal in Article 2.1 and the net zero goal, as we call it, in Article 4.1, as compared to adaptation, which is a far more qualitative goal, the global goal on adaptation in Article 7, but also Article 2, the sort of adaptation and climate resilience goals are far more qualitative rather than quantitative In relation to the legal character of provisions, there's a distinction between mitigation, again, where there are binding obligations, procedural, but binding obligations that are far more specific, as opposed to the provisions in relation to adaptation, which are far more qualitative and have a sort of context setting and narrative function, and are sort of framed in a way that would probably be more appropriate in a preamble of a treaty rather than in operational provisions. The requirements and details associated with adaptation and mitigation are also quite different. And the extent of financial support provided as well in relation to mitigation and adaptation are quite different. Adaptation is less than 15%, and that's a very generous sort of assessment of how much finance actually goes to adaptation and loss and damage. And loss and damage as well, although there's been more of a focus on it since the Paris Agreement in Article 8 and the relevant paragraph in decision 1 CP21. There's been a lot more focus on loss and damage, but the focus has been primarily on information sharing and knowledge sharing rather than sort of specificities of who pays how much, because these have obviously been polarized. The Loss and Damage Fund, a huge step forward, but there's a lot of modalities still to be worked out. So my broader question for discussion is the framework that is provided by the UN climate regime actually fit for purpose, given the trajectory that we are on in relation to mitigation? So it's clear from recent reports, that overshoot is inevitable, that we're not on track to 1.5, far from it. The UNFCCC's synthesis report in 2023, just before the COP, the last COP, said that we were more likely on track to 2.1 to 2.8 degrees centigrade. There have been a sort of series of records that we've broken over the last several years. And it's clear that the UN climate change regime is not, is my 3 minutes up?
No, we're trying to write something down and it's difficult.
Sorry, but I'm sure my 3 minutes is up, so. So how does the UN climate change regime need to adapt to the direction in which the world is going and how much warming there is? Because there is, as I said, a clear distinction between how adaptation is being treated as opposed to mitigation. And should, going forward, our focus be a lot more on adaptation rather than mitigation. This is not to take the focus away from mitigation, as some feared, but to say that we need to be treating adaptation, loss and damage a lot more seriously, given we are, given climate impacts are in the here and now, and given those impacts are going to accelerate and escalate in the coming years. So this is a question both about the level at which governance should happen and is best delivered, sort of as international, regional, local, and also the potential and limits of legal intervention in this space. More broadly, the question is really one of future-proofing the UN climate change regime to account for the sort of increasing demands on it in relation to adaptation and loss and damage. And if this is not done within the regime, it's certainly something that will be done outside the regime in terms of sort of addressing inadequate adaptation action. And because there are sort of increasing demands on accountability for the extent to which governments are actually adapting to climate change. And I think this goes to Miles' point about sort of climate litigation and attribution science, perhaps. But we have seen recent cases, including the Torres Strait Islanders case in 2022 before the UN Human Rights Committee, which found that Australia's failure to sufficiently adapt to climate change and protect indigenous sort of Torres Islanders against the adverse impacts of climate change actually violated their rights to culture and to be free from arbitrary interferences with private life, family, and home. So this is just the first of the kinds of cases that we're going to see in relation to inadequate adaptation action. There are many other cases in the pipeline. So I guess the themes I think I'd like to throw into the discussion, and also questions for Koko perhaps, are how does the international legal framework adapt to the increasing adverse and escalating adverse effects? And how does the climate change regime in particular need to be future-proofed for this? And how do we enhance accountability for lack of sufficient adaptation action? Thank you.
Thank you, Lavanya. Nicola.
Thank you. It's always difficult to go last, isn't it? But Well, so I want to talk about three things. So one is mobilizing finance for adaptation and why that's hard and what we can do about it. I want to talk a bit about nature, and I want to talk about what on earth is systemic resilience, which I'm executive director of. But first, I want to say a word about Koko, actually. So I've known Koko, I think, since about 2008, I think, when we wrote a paper together on insurance and adaptation. And well, firstly, just thank you so much, Koko, for being with us today. I know, a really difficult day for you, and thank you. I think your commitment to this and whole agenda, really, really grateful for. And one thing, I've learned many things from Koko over the years. Been, a bit of a sort of a star in this area for me. I remember one of the first things I noticed about Koko, working with her, is she calls everyone a colleague. And I remember when I first started working with her, and I was quite young, sort of in my mid-20s when I started working with her, and I think, why does she call everyone a colleague? And then it sort of took me a little while to realize why she was doing it, because what I think Koko is extremely good at is that she's incredibly patient, and she brings everyone on a journey with her. And she uses this language of a colleague, and I assume, Koko, you're doing, so I hope this is actually why you do it. But what I interpreted it is that she brings you in and sees everyone, even if we work in different countries, different organizations, whole different disciplines, as colleagues all working towards the same goal. And actually, I do this now as well, so I call everyone a colleague, because we are colleagues. We're academics here at Oxford, or the wider public and people around the world. We are all colleagues working together towards this joint goal. And I want to thank you, Koko, for that huge inspiration. I think that's, it's really important to realize that that's what we're doing here. We're all working together. Maybe we have different views on certain things, but we have the same goal. And I think we should feel very grateful for the work and the opportunity to do that. Coming on to the more sort of specific comments. So Salima, I only really met in person probably only a couple of years ago, although, again, another huge star in this area. And I was always really scared about meeting him. And one of the reasons I was really scared about meeting him is because he's very focused on the people-centered approach, is all about local communities. And my work is all about global systems and big finance, and how do we make big finance work for adaptation and nature as well. And so I was petrified when I first met. So I remember we were on a panel together, and I gave my big spiel, which I will do now, on why big finance is important. And I knew he was going to come in afterwards and say completely the opposite about why we need to think about communities. But actually, and I hope I'll sort of show you that the two things have to align. And he's important. He did agree, and he's incredibly supportive, and he was a wonderful person. And so why the big finance is important? So in the context of negotiations, we focus very much on how to mobilize climate finance, which is in the sort of hundreds of millions, but actually, research, including by UNEP and others, has shown we need to get it to over 300 billion a year just for emerging and developing economies on adaptation, and we're a long way from that. And part of my work is around, actually, yes, that's absolutely critical in mobilizing this climate finance, but we also have to remember that we have about 6 trillion a year going into the agricultural sector around the world that actually isn't accounting for climate change. We have about 2.7 trillion a year going into infrastructure around the world, which is not accounting for climate change. So all of this is coming into economic development and growth, but isn't accounting for climate change. So actually, we're focusing in the negotiations on how do we mobilize an extra 100 billion or so here and there, when actually the train of finance is pushing us in totally the wrong direction and potentially undermining that resilience. So a lot of, I think, as well as focusing on the negotiations, we have to make finance work for this agenda. And at the moment, all of the focus is on how do we get finance into net zero, which is actually incredibly important, but we also have to finance, how do we make it work for adaptation, and how do we make it work for nature as well. And I'll come back to how we bring the people side into this in a moment. But just also a point on nature. So again, fairly recently started working on nature, because most of my career has been on climate. But the fact that we are eroding the natural capital on which our economies are based are massively undermining our resilience to climate change, but also our economic development around the world. So we just put out some work last week, for example, showing even in the UK, we're potentially wiping off 6, 8, 10% of GDP because of the damage to nature that's being caused. And that's even bigger for countries like Bangladesh, where Salima was based, and many other developing countries. So unless we tackle nature, you can't tackle climate change and not manage these issues on nature as well. So yeah, I think a key part of the story on adaptation has to be, how do we build that underpinning capacities of our societies, both people, the natural capital that they're dependent on, to really strengthen their resilience. And then my final point on the systemic resilience part. Again, I think one of the key challenges that we have in thinking about this agenda is we often talk about risk. So we think about how do we estimate risk? But what we don't, and it's seen as a very negative agenda. So adaptation is seen as a negative agenda about reducing risk. And it's very difficult to motivate people to act on something that's negative, avoiding something that's negative. But actually, if we can turn it around and think about how do we actually build resilience of communities, enable them to achieve SDGs, I think if we can switch it around and talk about how do we build resilience of whole systems. And I think this is absolutely critical, because again, if we can recognize that, for example, when you make an investment, this can actually support the resilience of communities if you do it in the right way and value that properly in decisions, I think actually we can make a very big difference, because at the moment we're not doing that. So that's just a small word on the systemic resilience side. And how we bring all this down to people. So actually, inspired by Salima and many others, Koko and others, I think one of the challenges in how we think about adaptation as well, and the economics of adaptation, is it doesn't naturally build in people. We think about it, cost-benefit analysis terms of, what's the economic benefit in terms of reduced losses to infrastructure or buildings versus the cost of that. But we don't take into account the distributional impacts of that in our decisions at the moment. Widespread in the UK, anywhere. And actually, one thing that we're very keen to do is look at a new way of thinking about how you prioritize different investment decisions that really puts people at the center of it. And we've now have a version of yours, Benito, which is called Just Adaptation. So how do we bring people in more into these decisions over adaptation? And I hope that, with actually in honor of Salima, that we can make some progress in providing lots of new data and tools that actually put people at the center of decision making.
Thank you very much. Now, when I agreed to chair this, I was told, okay, there's going to be a panel discussion and you better come up with some questions. I said, nah. And I was right. Lavanya provided one. And so I suggest, because it is an intriguing one, and it probably sort of touches on all the expertise of the three panelists and Koko, obviously. Lavanya asked us, is the UNFCCC fit for purpose, where we are? And that's an interesting question, because, what's the purpose of the international climate change regime, which goes beyond just the decisions of the governing bodies, of the protocols and things. And so I would be really quite keen to hear what you think. Basically, I guess the question is, now that we are implementing, we are hopefully not going to negotiate a new treaty, even though the time is ripe, right? I mean, in terms of we're implementing the Paris Agreement. So what is this? What is the multilateral system for? And in that context, once you have an idea of what the purpose is it fit for purpose as it is, and if not, what to do? So shall we start with Koko?
Okay, well, to read out Article 2 of the UNFCCC Convention, which I won't do, Ivania, you're much, much better suited, but it's exactly the question, what is the purpose? And what is the vehicle to deliver on that purpose? And since I worked at UNFCCC for 7 years, I'm not going to answer the question. I'll be diplomatic. But of course, the purpose is to avoid dangerous anthropogenic climate change. I think I didn't get the wording quite right, with 3 caveats. And Sam and Nicola, Ivania, I think as well, alluded to these caveats, that we do avoid that danger in timeframes that are relevant for natural systems to adapt. And we have not yet done that. And so if you use those 3 caveats just as to answer your question, Ivania, the answer might be not yet. The other is about food security, and Sam, especially for you and your very important work on economic systems. And I didn't get the wording quite right, but what we're not doing yet is avoiding dangerous anthropogenic climate change. We're very much in it. We have profound destructive impacts on our natural systems, Nicola, that you mentioned, that sustain our very lives. Food production, I think, is going to start being a real question in the coming years. Many of you are experts, as well as our economic systems and the opportunities for development, at least as we've been thinking about it until now. Now, on the other end, I wax a little bit philosophical in that we have a deeply social challenge here, which we have created together, not equally. And the way out is probably social as well. And in terms of bringing countries together, be it for the political theater of the conversation, or for sometimes the really valuable interaction with experts, and that's something I loved. I remember many, many meetings, Salim and Benito and many of you, Nicola, I think you came as an expert, and probably everybody in the room, that really very valuable interaction between the expert communities and people who after the session go back and they're like buried in a ministry somewhere. It's valuable. It doesn't necessarily bend the curve of dangerous anthropogenic climate change, and it certainly does not do that quickly. But for our current values, I don't know another way to do it other than convening and seeking consensus together. But many of you have had thoughts about that. Over to you.
Right, over to Nicola.
So I feel that the UNFCCC has formed an absolutely vital role in getting us to where we are now. But I think that my view on it is that we can't see that that is the only forum to deal with this issue. And its consensus role is absolutely vital, and is, in terms of the big international agreements, is getting us where we need to be. But actually, I think now we have to look to really make climate and nature a real priority across a number of other areas, and that is happening. But certainly on the adaptation side, I think adaptation is a long way behind. So, for example, you'll see in the G20 discussions, net zero is always, up high. Nature is starting to get in there as well. In all the discussions on reforming the global financial system, again, net zero is right up there. All of these various other fora as well. But actually, the adaptation is often left behind. And I think we need to do much more in terms of showing these other fora that, and we will always need multiple fora, that actually adaptation is a key part of what they're doing as well. So that would be my ask to the world.
I just, in the context of adaptation, since I've been around for a while, I remember in the early days, adaptation was actually a bad word. Okay? And the reason was very simple, because the oil and gas industry used it. They said, we don't need to mitigate, we just adapt. So it took a while for that to change, to come to the realization it's not an either or thing. It's absolutely an and thing. And the same is happening with loss and damage. Okay, we're progressing, possibly not fast enough, but it's getting there. Okay, Sam.
Yeah, Lavanya is a senior negotiator, and she's sort of within fist distance of where I sit, so I have to be careful what I say. I sort of agree with Nicola and Koko that the distinction you mentioned is the UNFCCC fit for purpose and the international system. And those are not the same things. And we have to think of the international system to provide a lot of the answers, and that includes the G20, the G7, the multilateral development banks, the international aid agencies, World Bank, IMF, and so on. And if you think of that as a sort of an ensemble, then yeah, we're less unfit for purpose, let's put it that way. And within the sort of that ensemble, where is the role of the UNFCCC? I think one of the purposes there is just to have the pace and the rhythm and the sort of the annual conference of the party that forces the issue on the agenda. You can't switch off because it's always there. You sort of, there's a process there that forces you to think about it and do something about it and continue talking about it. And I think that's incredibly valuable. And if you sort of think what the alternative would be, it's probably not working either. So the beauty of the UNFCCC is that everybody is there, everybody has a voice, everybody has a vote, which slows things down, but it also means it's a participatory process. So we need it.
I couldn't agree more. In particular, when people ask me this, my response is usually, I guess you could solve the mitigation problem with the 10 largest emitters, I don't know. No? But forget adaptation then, okay? Because that regime would be purely mitigation. The one reason why the UNFCCC process is important is that the small guys, the poor guys, also have a voice. Not always sufficient, but they are not excluded, which otherwise they would be, okay? And one of the problems where the thing is going right now with these mega COPs is that the small guys do get excluded. I mean, no small island state could possibly host a COP anymore at that size. So that something has, we're working on it, something has to happen. Lavanya.
Well, just to agree with the other panelists, Sam and Nicola, and also you, Benito, I do think, of course, that the UNFCCC is sort of salient and performs a function that only the UNFCCC, or the climate regime, can in this context, which is to provide normative signals and direction of travel for the community. But it is not the only shop in town, and I think that's evident from everything we've been saying. But I think in particular, it's not the only shop in town, also because the fundamental premise in the UN climate change regime, goes back to something you were saying, Nicola, about the cost-benefit analysis. So even when we look at Article 2 of the Framework Convention, which sort of tells us that we should stabilize greenhouse gas emissions at a level that would prevent dangerous anthropogenic interference with the global climate system, the level at which interference is dangerous is not defined in Article 2, and that was determined, between states. What is dangerous? If it's actually people-centered and human rights-centered, that would not be determined based on a cost-benefit or sort of which country is willing to do what and what level is dangerous, right? So even at 1.5 degrees, we're seeing sort of horrendous impacts on people. So why is it that the UNFCCC, even 1.5 is an aspirational goal for the UNFCCC and the UN climate change regime? So there are limitations to the regime in terms of how it can actually function to be people-centered and human rights-centered, which is part of the reason, of course, that the Paris Agreement contains that preambular sort of recital on human rights, which seeks to sort of at least provide a normative environment within which the Paris Agreement and climate change treaties need to be interpreted in a more sort of people-centered, human rights-centered way. But it is also the reason why we need to look at several other treaties, at least coming from a legal perspective, several other treaties, customary international law norms, and sort of the normative environment within which these treaties sit, basically, to interpret them in a way that actually delivers a climate-safe future for us, and not just look at the Paris Agreement and interpret its provisions in a sort of atomistic manner, which sort of limits what we can do, both in terms of adaptation, but also in terms of the centrality of national determination in the Paris Agreement, which is privileged. National autonomy is privileged, and that's not, the extent to which it is privileged is not something that's going to help us get where we need to go. even in terms of the goals of the Paris Agreement itself. So it is important. It is salient. It's the only shop in town that includes, as you say, those who are concerned about loss and damage and adaptation, and their voices are heard. Yes, if we have a major emitters forum, it will be, the big guys, and it will be the coalition of the unwilling. So we certainly don't need that, and that's not going to take the place of the UNFCCC or the UN climate change regime. But there are limitations to the regime, and we need to recognize that and place it within the larger systemic, institutional context, but also legal context.
May I argue against something you said, Benito?
Of course.
So the problem can be solved by 10 big emitters?
Oh, well, 11?
So I think one of the challenges, so most of my work is in emerging and developing economies, dabble in a bit of UK occasionally, but I think we cannot get to net zero unless all countries are on that journey. And yes, we could deal with the top 10 emitters now, but that's not going to get us to net zero by 2050. All countries will need to make some measures. And I think one of the challenges of the view that actually we need to focus on the big emitters that I hear a lot from developing countries is they're not getting the support that they need to get onto a climate compatible growth path at the moment, because the focus is all on the high emitting countries, but also the sort of the South Africas and the Indonesias, the big next set. But I think we really need to have a narrative that actually shows that we need to support all countries on this net zero transition.
Just to reply, when I said 10 biggest emitters, I did not say north or south, okay? And I hope you agree that whatever the Bahamas does, it doesn't really matter.
No, but so yes, it does actually matter what the Bahamas does, but certainly, let's look at, say, many African economies, and which are really struggling from massive debt sustainability issues at the moment. Actually, unless we can support countries like that to enable them to put themselves on a growth path towards a sustainable future, we will see not just emissions, but also massive destruction of their environments, which will add to the problem in the long term. So I do feel that this is something that everyone has to be on this journey, if you're Bermuda or South Africa or the US.
Okay.
Can I just weigh in on Nicola's side on this one? Also, from a legal perspective, there are so many of the national and actually even the regional human rights court decision that came out 2 weeks ago, the Swiss senior women's case, essentially noted the point that the drop in the ocean argument that any one state's contributions don't make a difference, noted the argument and rejected it. So there have been many cases around the world that have actually rejected that, from Australia to sort of the European Court of Human Rights. So there are many decisions that have actually rejected that argument. This is a global challenge, and there has to be global and ownership and solutions that everyone, is part of a journey.
Okay. Questions? Yes, we have two over there. Please, if it's for an individual panelist, including Koko, just say so. Otherwise, introduce yourself and speak into the microphone. Thank you.
Thank you very much. My name is Raghav Pant. I'm a senior research associate at the Environmental Change Institute. And thank you very much for all the panelists and Koko for this very insightful talks. I had a question about this discussion about mitigation and adaptation, and kind of almost, it seems that we are kind of doing a trade-off between the two, and we find that there are probably a lot of synergies between the two, how we tackle the problem either at the UNFCCC level or even at the level of, as Nicola was talking about, infrastructure financing, because lots of projects which are talking about development will also kind of include adaptation in them, and also at the research level at which we work, where we think about long-term planning models, which focus on clean net zero transitions and everything, but do not talk about climate shocks, which might kind of not enable some of those transitions. So I just wanted to know the panel's views on what do you see are these gaps which are preventing us? But first of all, whether do you think it is valuable to find synergies between mitigation and adaptation in our approaches at every level of discussion that we are having? And what do you see are the barriers and the gaps in which prevent us from kind of finding solutions to kind of bring them together? Thank you very much.
Well, there goes another hour. Anyone wish to tackle that?
Yeah, I can have a go, and that gives other people time to think. We're sort of moving into a direction where those issues are increasingly converging and treated as the same, and then adding broader sustainability issues into the mix, and I think that's the right direction of travel. Historically, why it hasn't happened is goes back to what sort of Benito outlined. It used to be the sort of the bad name, in a sense, that adaptation used to have as a sort of a distraction from reducing emissions. When people sort of thought mitigation, adaptation were substitutes, you do either one or the other. We have learned that they are complements, you have to do both of them, and that's true at the abstract sort of aggregate global level, if you will. It's also true if you look at individual sectors. If you look at housing, you can't decarbonize housing without also thinking a little bit about, overheating and what happens to the climate. Same is true with agriculture. Same is true with sort of the broader growth agenda, productivity, which we go on about. You can't sort of have that debate with either only emissions or only adaptation. It just doesn't work. Institutionally, we are getting there, but we are not quite there yet. The UK is an interesting example there. The Climate Change Committee, actually when I sat on these things, there was the Climate Change Committee and the Adaptation Subcommittee. So the hierarchy was in the name. They have now, they're increasingly merging. There's still two committees, but they're increasingly working together. And that's, in a sense, that's just an institutional mirror of where the discussion is going.
Anyone else?
Just a small point, I think. The sort of relationship between mitigation and adaptation is sort of recognized also in, of course, the Paris Agreement in Article 7, where, of course, the more mitigation there is, the less adaptation will be needed. So that interaction is very well understood, I think, and there are, I guess, efforts to ensure that that relationship is well understood and operationalized in the implementation of the agreement. But I think in terms of adaptation itself, what is it that we're adapting to? We're adapting to a world that needs to be moving towards net zero. And so a lot of the adaptation strategies now, I think, are informed by the idea that you're not just going back to status quo ante, you're not sort of adapting to the world as it was, but you're adapting to a new world. So in that sense, mitigation is also built into, or should be built into, adaptation strategies going forward. And I think that's recognition that's coming through in some of the suggestions that have been made in the UN process.
Koko?
Well, it's amazing, and I have a similar question actually to the people in the room. What methodologies are you thinking about to understand exactly what Ivania just said? It's like when you're, I don't know if any of you shoot clay pigeons, but you shoot ahead of where the pigeon is going to be, sorry. But really to anticipate the multiple dynamics and prepare, plan, and finance something that will be significantly different in the future. I don't know if any of you are operational researchers or if you're thinking about this. Maybe Nicola, you can answer my question. How do we actually do both mitigation and adaptation? It surely can't be that different from the real economy anyway, but I don't think it's a very familiar way for those of us who are really trained up in the UNFCCC context, how to even think about the, I'll say system, because Nicola, I'm looking right at you at the moment.
Nicola.
What you do, and just sort of building on the last question, it is absolutely ridiculous to think about adaptation and mitigation separately. So what is adaptation and mitigation? It's about infrastructure, it's about energy systems, it's about our agricultural systems, all of which are very vulnerable to climate and all of which need to be made net zero. So if you're making an investment, you're making a policy in any of those areas and you're not thinking about both, you will be disadvantaging the other one. It is ridiculous. So, and in terms of and I think that these actually, to say something negative about the processes at the moment, the fact that there are reasons why we have divided them, but the fact that we've done that has led to a lot of perverse systems to be set up that have created this artificial divide. So, for example, you have the adaptation fund, and then you have funds for mitigation, and you have different policies for each. They often sit in different government departments, and so we've created a system now which actually forces us to separate them, and actually that's making it worse for both the net zero side and for the adaptation side, and also nature now as well. And so this is a big problem. And in terms of, sort of how to do the two things together, actually it's not rocket science, because for example, again, I talk a lot about investment because I work with a lot of financial institutions, but they will be used to, when they make an investment, they will be thinking about multiple objectives, they'll be thinking about multiple risks. That's the way that they do it. This is a normal way of thinking. So actually, I think it's us as the climate community that have created this artificial divide, which has led to many problems.
Thank you. Maybe just, you've heard of the global goal on adaptation, right? Well, Kholisa Nwala, who's the father of it, I always said, I have no idea what you mean. I literally, what do you mean a global goal on adaptation, right? So a year ago, we wrote a piece together where we tried to figure, conceptually make it solid. And what we came up with is the following. It's, I think, quite simple. We have a risk profiles, different sectors and whatnot, which are correlated to temperatures, right? So, say 1.5, you have in the housing sector somewhere, you have a certain risk profile. Now we overshoot the temperature, risk profile changes. We cannot reverse this always with adaptation, but in some cases we can. We can go, by doing adaptation, we can reverse the risk profile to what it was, what we meant it to be. And that would be the goal on adaptation, to do that where possible, okay? At least then the notion of goal makes sense. It is relative to mitigation, or to missed mitigation action. So the primacy is still mitigation, but since we have lost the case of actually doing enough, we might as well start to complement with adaptation actions, to try to still remain within. Yeah, go on.
May I argue against you?
Yeah.
Sorry, I'm like the naughty child on the panel tonight. So yes, I totally agree. But I think we often make it too complicated on adaptation as well. Because I'm a former climate scientist, but maybe I could speak to the much better climate scientists in the room, in that we are already locked into climate over the next 20, maybe 30 years. And actually, there's very little, unfortunately, that we can do about that. So we have to do adaptation. When we're thinking about a global goal, a lot of that global goal is not dependent on mitigation, actually. So because a lot of that action are actions that we'll be taking in the short term. There are a few areas, like a very long-term infrastructure, that we might need to worry about taking a different decision based on the mitigation outcome. But actually, the vast majority of decisions we need to make on adaptation are actually within that envelope. So actually, it's not mitigation dependent.
But the point is, mine was purely a conceptual analysis as a philosopher. Basically, does it make sense to speak about a goal on adaptation, which it didn't initially, right? But we can talk. Right, Philip.
Philip's here, Oxford Physics. We speak a lot about adaptation, and that's really important. And we speak about adaptation on very small scales, coastal communities. And obviously, for that to be meaningful, we need to know what to adapt to. And so that brings me a little bit back to the physical climate science. And I'd like to hear the views of the panel do we know enough what to adapt to, or is it good enough to at the moment rely on climate models where we know strong biases, we know the coarse scales, we know lots of limitations, or do we need to develop new strategies? Or from your perspective, what would you really like from the physical climate science community?
Please.
Okay, let me try, and then Nicola can disagree. There is sort of, certain things matter more than others, and as Nicola just said, I would agree with that. If you sort of have a 20, 30 year time horizon, the sort of the temperature paths don't bifurcate very much. They're pretty much given. So you don't need more information about that unless you build a sort of 100-year system where it starts mattering again. Where it would be quite useful to have better information is adaptation is at the very local granular level. So we want very detailed information about what's happening in my community or around my bridge, that sort of thing. And it isn't just about temperature, it's then about almost forecasting weather sort of kind of variables. One example that often comes up is, again, it's an adaptation mitigation interaction is what will climate change do to wind speeds? And you will tell me you might know, but most people I talk to say they don't. And that can start becoming a problem when we sort of build an energy system that's based on offshore wind. It's that sort of type of information where we need more of. At the moment, we sort of make information based on deep uncertainty, and there are methods that you can apply to do that, but obviously be nicer if you could make decisions based on probabilities, for example, or even a sort of an element of knowledge. Nicola, now you can disagree.
No, I agree with that. And I think that one of the reasons why I'm so passionate about this particular question about what we need to adapt to and whether we know enough is that we often hear it as a reason not to adapt, that we don't know what path we're on. So, actually over the last 3 months, I've been working a lot with banks and insurers and asset managers, asset owners, who are really starting to move on this agenda, which is very exciting, that they're finally sort of looking really at how do we bring more money into this area. One of the big questions, or the big excuses that they'll say is, we don't know what scenario to adapt to. We don't have the data to do it. And we've spent a lot of time talking through the basis of what we know and what we don't know. And I would say, there's a lot of improvements in information that are needed, particularly in terms of the local scale. But actually, in many cases, the vast majority of cases, either these are things that are sort of low or no regrets type interventions, or they're things that are, we know how to adapt under uncertainty. So, for example, we collectively, colleagues, have designed a Thames barrier that can cope with anything from a 50 centimetre sea level rise to a 4 metre sea level rise in London. So we've been able to design a system that can cope with that. So there are engineering and other solutions to do this. So it's not, the lack of information is not a barrier. We know how to do that. Lots of great examples to do that. But certainly there are many, many gaps, particularly at the local scale.
Koko?
Well, Philip, if I had a wish list, which I do, I would ask you and your wonderful colleagues, sorry, Nicola, you, to provide us whatever is possible on spatial and temporal resolutions, picking up on your point, Sam, about wind speed, precipitation, heat. I'd like to know about rates of change, spatial scale of change, over what periods of time. That would be incredibly helpful for programming and preparedness. Whether it is a 6 month out that really gets in the kind of in the Met service realm, or whether it's a decade or 15 or 20 years out, would be incredibly useful. I'm in the world of population movement, and it's very different from your world, but once people start moving, it creates a kind of social vacuum effect, and anticipating some of the physical realities as much as possible would be really helpful. Thank you.
Thank you. Lavanya?
You can ask a lawyer, what advances in science. I'm not sure this is going to be very helpful, but
inclusive.
Okay. I would say actually at least from an international legal perspective, we have the science and the information that we need to do what we need to be doing, but we're not doing it. So I think the bigger question is, why aren't we doing what we need to do given the information that we already have? Of course, I think at the granular level, there's a lot more information that we could harvest and which would be useful. But I think even at the big picture level, we're just not doing enough with the science that we already have.
May I just add a small point, which I think to the big thing that worries me that we don't yet have good enough information on is the big sort of systems level risks. And that, we're not taking into those sorts of system level risks. So we heard Raghav, who does obviously a huge amount of wonderful work on infrastructure systems. So these sort of interconnected risks across countries that can cascade and amplify, and we have very little information on those at the moment, and that's really critical for decision making, both within UNFCCC, but also local planning as well.
Disagree with you. Helen.
That's because we're out of time. Please join me in thanking Benito and the panel for a wonderful discussion. I'd also like to thank Koko again for such a wonderful talk and for taking time to be with us despite everything else she's got going on this week, and we really, really appreciate that. Thank you.
Thank you.
And you should consider that you have an open invitation to come visit us anytime you like in Oxford, so please do come and meet us in person sometime. And
That's
a dinner.
a privilege. Thank you. Thanks. Thank you so much.
Okay, so the event does not end here. We can continue the conversation with refreshments in hand in the garden room. So when you leave to the right in the foyer, turn right, and the garden room is on your left after about 100 yards. There are some posters there displaying work by some of our OCRN early career researchers, and there should be some wine and soft drinks ready. So I will see you over there.